August 1945. The Pacific island of Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands chain. Following the Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender on August 15th, scattered Japanese military units and civilian populations remained isolated across Pacific territories. For thousands of Japanese civilians trapped on islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the formal cessation of hostilities meant little in practical terms. Allied bombers had ceased their operations. Naval bombardment no longer threatened the landscape. Yet the silence carried profound uncertainty for those who had endured months of wartime propaganda. The Battle of Saipan had concluded in July 1944, more than a year earlier. US Marine and Army forces had secured the island after fierce fighting that claimed approximately 3,000 American lives and an estimated 30,000 Japanese military casualties. Civilian deaths numbered in the thousands, with tragic incidents at locations such as Marpi Point, where propaganda and fear drove mass suicides. By war's end, approximately 22,000 Japanese civilians remained on Saipan under US military administration. If you appreciate evidence-based World War II history presented with primary source documentation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating where you're watching from. We have viewers worldwide interested in Pacific War history. The women in this account resided in small villages across Saipan's interior and coastal regions. Many were wives of agricultural workers who had migrated to Saipan during Japan's administration of the island under League of Nations mandate since 1920. Others were widows of soldiers killed during the 1944 battle. Some were young women, barely adults, who had known only wartime conditions. Their experiences reflected broader patterns documented across Japanese-controlled Pacific territories as Allied forces advanced. For these civilian populations, surrender represented more than military defeat. Years of systematic propaganda had shaped expectations of enemy conduct. The Japanese government's information campaigns, intensifying from 1943 onward, portrayed Allied forces, particularly American troops, as barbaric and dishonorable. Official posters, radio broadcasts, and military briefings emphasized that capture meant violation, torture, and death. Women specifically were warned that American soldiers would commit mass sexual assault. This messaging served strategic purposes within Japanese military doctrine. The government sought to prevent surrenders and maintain civilian support for continued resistance. Military commanders, facing inevitable defeats across the Pacific, promoted the concept that honorable death superseded the shame of capture. Women received explicit instructions to carry concealed weapons. Family elders counseled that death represented the only acceptable outcome if enemy forces arrived. Historical records from US military government files on Saipan indicate that overcoming these propaganda-induced fears represented a significant challenge for occupation authorities. Declassified reports from the island command headquarters note that initial civilian contact operations required extensive efforts to demonstrate non-hostile intent. Military government officers reported that many civilians expected immediate execution or abuse upon contact with American forces. The propaganda system that shaped these women's expectations had evolved throughout Japan's military expansion. By 1943, as strategic reversals mounted following defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Japanese government intensified domestic and overseas information campaigns. The Greater East Asia Ministry and military information bureaus coordinated messaging across occupied territories. Propaganda materials recovered by Allied forces and analyzed in post-war studies reveal systematic patterns. Posters depicted American soldiers as demons or monsters. Radio broadcasts, transmitted in Japanese across Pacific islands, repeated claims about Allied atrocities. Leaflets distributed to civilian populations on islands like Saipan contained graphic descriptions of alleged American conduct toward captured civilians in other theaters. Military units retreating through Saipan's interior during the 1944 battle carried these messages directly to civilian communities. Soldiers, facing defeat, repeated warnings as they moved through villages. Declassified interrogation reports from captured Japanese soldiers indicate that many genuinely believed the propaganda they spread. Some accounts suggest military personnel encouraged civilian suicides rather than capture, viewing this as preferable to perceived humiliation. The psychological impact on civilian populations was profound. Women interviewed in post-war oral history projects, conducted decades later by researchers studying Pacific War civilian experiences, consistently reported that fear of sexual violence dominated their expectations. Mothers stated they prepared to kill their children rather than allow capture. Extended families discussed collective suicide as groups. This conditioning reflected broader Japanese cultural contexts regarding honor and shame, concepts manipulated by wartime authorities. Traditional social structures that emphasized family honor were weaponized to prevent surrenders. Women, already occupying subordinate positions in wartime Japanese society, faced particularly acute pressure to choose death over the imagined disgrace of capture. U.S. military planners, aware of these dynamics through intelligence reports and previous island campaigns, had developed specific protocols for civilian contact operations. The U.S. Navy's Military Government Handbook for Saipan, compiled before the June 1944 invasion, included sections addressing civilian surrender procedures and treatment policies. These documents emphasized that proper treatment of civilians served both humanitarian and strategic purposes, demonstrating to Japanese populations that surrender was survivable, encouraged future surrenders, potentially reducing casualties on both sides. When American patrols entered villages in Saipan's interior and coastal regions in August 1945, they operated under established military government protocols. The U.S. Navy, which administered Saipan through the Island Command Structure, had instituted detailed regulations for civilian interactions. These policies, documented in command directives, specified that troops would maintain physical distance from civilian populations except when necessary for security or aid distribution. The actual encounter described in this account follows patterns documented across multiple Pacific Island locations. Women, hiding in damaged structures or jungle areas, faced initial contact with American forces. These meetings typically involved Marine or Army patrols conducting sweep operations to locate remaining civilian populations. Personnel assigned to these operations received specific instructions regarding appropriate conduct. Military government records indicate that translators accompanied most patrols. These were often Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who served in military intelligence service units. Their role proved crucial as language barriers complicated initial contacts. Without translation, physical gestures and demonstrated non-threatening behavior formed the primary communication method. The provision of food and water represented standard protocol. Military government supply logs from Saipan show regular distributions to civilian detention areas. Supplies included sea rations, captured Japanese rice stocks, canned milk, and water transported in containers. Medical supplies, particularly for children and elderly civilians, received priority in distribution schedules. The psychological impact of this treatment on civilian populations cannot be understated. Women who anticipated immediate violence or death instead encountered restraint and material assistance. This dissonance between expectation and reality created profound confusion, as documented in post-war interviews and written accounts preserved in archives. The physical distance maintained by American personnel reflected both policy and practical considerations. Military commanders recognized that close physical contact could trigger panic given civilian conditioning. Additionally, regulations aimed to prevent any conduct that might be interpreted as harassment or assault. Courts-martial records from the Pacific Theater show that violations of civilian contact policies resulted in prosecutions, indicating command commitment to enforcement. Nighttime security arrangements followed similar principles. Guards maintained perimeters around temporary civilian assembly areas, but did not enter spaces designated for women and children without specific necessity and announcement. This separation served security functions while providing civilians with protected space. The movement of civilian populations to centralized detention camps reflected military government planning conducted before island invasions. On Saipan, the Navy established Camp Susupe, as the primary civilian internment facility. By the war's end, Camp Susupe housed approximately 18,000 Japanese and Korean civilians under military government administration. The march to Camp Susupe from outlying villages typically occurred over 1 or 2 days, depending on location. Military government reports describe organized movements with Marine or Army escorts. Civilians carried personal possessions, though many had lost everything during the battle a year earlier. Children, elderly individuals, and those with health issues received priority for vehicle transport when available. The camp structure followed established patterns for POW and civilian internment facilities, modified for Pacific theater conditions. Wooden barracks and canvas tents provided shelter. Separate areas housed men, women with children, and families. Perimeter security prevented unauthorized departures, but also protected inhabitants from potential harassment. Food distribution operated on scheduled systems. Navy supply records indicate that rations aimed to provide adequate nutrition, though shortages sometimes occurred given supply line constraints and the large civilian population. Rice formed the staple, supplemented with canned goods, vegetables when available, and protein sources including captured Japanese supplies and American military rations. Medical facilities at Camp Susupe included a hospital staffed by Navy medical personnel and civilian medical professionals among the internee population. Declassified medical reports document treatment of malnutrition, tropical diseases, wounds from the previous year's battle, and childhood illnesses. Medical officers noted that many civilians arrived in poor health after months of hardship. The provision of basic hygiene supplies, soap, brushes, cloth, reflected military government policies aimed at preventing disease outbreaks in crowded conditions. Public health concerns drove many administrative decisions, as epidemics could devastate concentrated populations. Internees received supplies for personal washing and clothing maintenance. Communication between internees and family members outside Saipan became possible through international Red Cross channels. The Red Cross maintained delegates in the Pacific Theater who facilitated message exchanges. These communications, limited to brief messages on standardized forms, represented the only contact many internees had with family members in Japan or on other islands. Records show that thousands of Red Cross messages originated from Camp Susupe between 1944 and 1946. The restraint demonstrated by American forces toward Japanese civilian women reflected military policies developed throughout the Pacific Campaign. These policies emerged from multiple factors: command directives, military justice systems, training protocols, and strategic considerations regarding future operations. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Ocean areas both issued directives addressing troop conduct towards civilian populations. These documents, preserved in National Archives holdings, explicitly prohibited assault, harassment, and unauthorized contact with civilians. Commanders viewed proper conduct as essential for maintaining discipline and achieving strategic objectives. Training materials for Marine and Army units heading to Pacific combat zones included instruction on civilian interaction protocols. While combat training dominated preparation, military government instruction covered expected encounters with civilian populations. Personnel learned that civilians might be terrified, potentially suicidal, and required careful handling. The military justice system enforced conduct standards through courts-martial. Records from Pacific Theater courts-martial, available through military archives, show prosecutions for various offenses, including assault, theft from civilians, and unauthorized entry into civilian areas. Convictions resulted in punishments ranging from reduction in rank to imprisonment. This enforcement demonstrated command commitment to maintaining standards. Strategic considerations also influenced policy. U.S. commanders recognized that Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as barbaric. By contradicting this propaganda through proper treatment of captured civilians, American forces aimed to encourage future surrenders. Intelligence reports noted that word of decent treatment spread among Japanese military units, potentially reducing resistance in subsequent operations. Individual conduct by American servicemen varied, as in any large military force. However, the systematic policies and enforcement mechanisms created an environment where proper conduct represented the norm rather than exception. This contrasted sharply with documented conduct by Japanese military forces towards civilian populations in occupied territories, where systematic sexual violence and brutality occurred on massive scales, as established by post-war tribunals and historical documentation. The gender composition of US military forces also played a role. While overwhelmingly male, the military included women serving in nursing, administrative, and support roles. Female personnel sometimes assisted in civilian operations, particularly regarding women and children, providing an additional layer of appropriate interaction. Beginning in September 1945, following Japan's formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, repatriation operations commenced for Japanese civilians detained across Pacific territories. The process, coordinated between US military authorities and Japanese government representatives, involved massive logistical undertakings. On Saipan, repatriation began in late 1945 and continued into 1946. Navy transport vessels carried civilians from Saipan to ports in Japan, primarily Yokohama, Sasebo, and Hakata. Each transport held hundreds of individuals, with voyages taking several days depending on weather and routing. The return to Japan brought survivors into a devastated homeland. American strategic bombing had destroyed major cities. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed over 200,000 people immediately, with thousands more dying from radiation effects. Conventional bombing had destroyed infrastructure across urban centers. Approximately 3 million Japanese military personnel and civilians had died during the war. For civilians returning from Saipan and other Pacific islands, reintegration proved challenging. Many returned to find homes destroyed and family members dead or missing. The social stigma of survival, when so many had died, added psychological burdens. Women who had been captured faced particular suspicions. Neighbors sometimes accused returnees of collaboration or improper conduct with enemy forces. This social pressure encouraged silence about detention experiences. Many women, fearing judgment or disbelief, avoided discussing their treatment by American forces. The disconnect between propaganda-driven expectations and actual experiences created cognitive dissonance difficult to articulate in a society processing overwhelming defeat and destruction. However, personal documents, diaries, letters, family histories preserved some accounts. Researchers conducting oral history projects decades later found that many women, particularly in private family contexts, had told their stories to daughters and granddaughters. These accounts consistently emphasized the absence of expected violence and the provision of basic necessities and dignity. Understanding individual experiences like those of Saipan's civilian women requires context regarding broader Pacific War civilian casualties. The war in Asia and the Pacific, from 1937 to 1945, if including the Sino-Japanese War, resulted in millions of civilian deaths across multiple nations. In the Pacific theater specifically, civilian casualties occurred through multiple causes: combat operations, bombing campaigns, disease, starvation, and direct violence. Japanese-occupied territories experienced massive civilian casualties from Japanese military actions. The Nanking Massacre of 1937–38 killed an estimated 200,000–300,000 Chinese civilians. Forced labor programs killed hundreds of thousands across Southeast Asia. Sexual slavery systems, euphemistically termed comfort women, victimized an estimated 200,000 women from Korea, China, Philippines, and other territories. American bombing campaigns against Japanese cities killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 immediately, with many more dying subsequently. These operations targeted civilian populations to destroy industrial capacity and break morale. On Pacific Islands, civilians died in combat crossfires, from naval bombardment and through suicide driven by propaganda. The tragedy at Marpi Point on Saipan, where hundreds jumped to deaths rather than surrender, exemplified propaganda's deadly impact. Similar incidents occurred on Okinawa, where civilian casualties reached 100,000–150,000 during the 1945 battle. Against this backdrop of massive civilian suffering, the relatively humane treatment of detained civilians on Saipan represented a contrast. While detention conditions involved hardship, inadequate nutrition, disease risk, separation from families, systematic violence and sexual assault did not characterize the American administration of civilian camps in the Pacific, according to available historical documentation. This does not suggest that individual violations never occurred. Military records document courts-martial for offenses against civilians. However, systematic policy emphasized proper treatment, enforcement mechanisms functioned, and large-scale atrocities of the type committed by Japanese forces in occupied territories did not characterize American conduct toward Japanese civilians in the Pacific theater. The experiences of Japanese civilian women detained by American forces on Saipan entered historical documentation through multiple channels over subsequent decades. Immediately post-war, military government reports provided official records of detention operations, supply distributions, and repatriation processes. These documents, declassified decades later, offer administrative perspectives. Japanese civilian perspectives emerged more gradually. In immediate post-war years, Japanese society focused on reconstruction and survival. The American occupation, lasting until 1952, complicated public discussion of wartime experiences. Many survivors remained silent due to trauma, social stigma, or uncertainty about how their stories would be received. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in subsequent decades, oral history projects began documenting Pacific War experiences. Researchers from Japanese and American universities conducted interviews with survivors. These projects aimed to preserve first-person accounts before that generation passed away. Women who had been detained on Saipan and other islands participated, describing their experiences decades after events. These accounts showed remarkable consistency regarding certain themes: the terror induced by propaganda, expectations of violence, and shock at relatively humane treatment. Many women reported that the absence of expected brutality represented the most memorable aspect of detention. Not because conditions were pleasant, but because the contrast with propaganda was so stark. Published memoirs and family histories also preserved accounts. Some women wrote private diaries or family histories late in life, documenting experiences for descendants. These documents, some held in family collections and others donated to archives, provide intimate perspectives on psychological impacts. Academic historians analyzing these sources have debated their significance. Some scholars emphasize that proper treatment of prisoners and civilians represents baseline legal and moral obligations, not exceptional behavior worthy of special recognition. International law, including the Geneva Conventions, establishes standards for civilian treatment during armed conflicts. Others argue that given the broader context of Pacific War atrocities, particularly Japanese military conduct toward civilians in occupied territories, the American military's maintenance of conduct standards toward Japanese civilians merits acknowledgement. This perspective suggests that in total war contexts, where dehumanizing propaganda operates on all sides, maintaining restraint represents significant institutional and individual discipline. Comparative analysis of military justice systems during World War II reveals significant differences in how Allied and Axis powers addressed troop conduct toward civilian populations. These differences had direct consequences for civilian experiences in occupied territories and detention situations. The U.S. military maintained an active courts-martial system throughout the war. Military justice processed cases involving crimes against civilians, including assault, theft, and unauthorized killings. Records show thousands of courts-martial in various theaters. Punishments for serious offenses included execution. Approximately 100 U.S. soldiers were executed during World War II for crimes including murder and rape. British Commonwealth forces maintained similar justice systems. The British Army's court-martial procedures prosecuted crimes against civilians in various theaters. Australian and Canadian forces operated parallel systems. Soviet military justice functioned differently. but also prosecuted some offenses against civilians, particularly in later war years, as political considerations influenced occupation policies. However, Soviet forces' conduct in occupied Germany and Eastern Europe included widespread violence against civilian populations, particularly women, with limited accountability. Japanese military justice systems generally did not prosecute crimes against non-Japanese civilians in occupied territories. The systemic nature of Japanese military atrocities, sexual slavery, forced labor, mass killings, indicates that such conduct was policy rather than violation of policy. Post-war tribunals documented that Japanese military doctrine explicitly viewed conquered populations as inferior and subject to exploitation. German military and SS forces similarly operated under doctrines that encouraged or mandated atrocities against civilian populations, particularly in Eastern Europe. The Holocaust and other genocidal policies represented systematic state actions rather than violations of German military law. This context matters for understanding the Saipan civilian experience. The proper treatment these women received reflected functioning institutional systems that established conduct standards, trained personnel, and enforced compliance through punishment of violations. These systems were imperfect, violations occurred, but they existed and operated, creating accountability mechanisms absent in Axis military structures. The treatment of civilians during wartime operates within frameworks established by international law. The Geneva Conventions, first adopted in 1864 and expanded through subsequent conferences, established standards for treatment of wounded soldiers, prisoners of war and civilians in conflict zones. By World War II, the 1929 Geneva Convention established POW treatment standards. However, civilian protection remained less developed legally. Japan had signed but not ratified the 1929 Convention and generally did not follow its provisions. The United States, United Kingdom, and other Allied powers had ratified the Convention and generally attempted compliance, though violations occurred. Civilian protection specifically gained comprehensive international legal framework through the Fourth Geneva Convention, adopted in 1949 in direct response to World War II civilian suffering. This convention established detailed requirements for protecting civilians in occupied territories and during armed conflicts. The Fourth Geneva Convention mandates that occupying powers must ensure food and medical supplies for civilian populations, maintain public health, protect civilians from violence, and allow communication with family members. These provisions codified many practices that US forces had implemented on Saipan and elsewhere, giving them formal legal standing. The convention also explicitly prohibits sexual violence, torture, and degrading treatment of civilians. These protections reflected recognition that such violations had occurred systematically during World War II, particularly by Axis forces, and required explicit prohibition. International humanitarian law continues evolving. Additional protocols adopted in 1977 and subsequent decades further strengthened civilian protections. Contemporary international law recognizes sexual violence in armed conflict as a war crime and potential crime against humanity, reflecting understanding developed partly from World War II experiences. The Saipan civilian experience illustrates these legal principles in practice. While the specific Fourth Geneva Convention provisions post-dated their detention, the treatment they received aligned with principles that would become codified law: provision of basic necessities, separation from military prisoners, protection from violence, and eventual repatriation. The psychological impact of the disconnect between propaganda-driven expectations and actual experiences has interested researchers studying trauma, belief systems, and societal recovery from conflict. The case of Japanese civilians detained by American forces provides documentation of such cognitive dissonance in extreme circumstances. Psychological research on belief persistence suggests that deeply held convictions, particularly those reinforced by authority figures and social consensus, resist change, even when contradicted by experience. The Japanese women on Saipan had been systematically conditioned to believe specific things about American forces. This conditioning came from government authorities, military personnel, family elders, and community consensus, all sources that normally provide reliable information within social structures. When experience contradicted these beliefs, when American forces provided food rather than violence, maintained distance rather than committing assault, psychological frameworks had to adapt. Research on similar situations suggests this adaptation occurs gradually and often incompletely. Initial experiences that contradict expectations may be interpreted as deceptive, temporary, or exceptional rather than representative. The accounts preserved in oral histories and written documents suggest that many women remained uncertain and fearful throughout their detention, despite accumulating evidence of proper treatment. Some continuously expected that violence would eventually occur, interpreting humane treatment as preparatory to later abuse. Others began acknowledging that propaganda had been false, but struggled to reconcile this recognition with lifelong conditioning. Post-traumatic effects from this experience differed from trauma caused by violence. These women experienced trauma from anticipated violence that did not occur, from the terror of expecting assault, and from the psychological whiplash of having core beliefs proven false. This differs from direct trauma caused by violence itself, but nonetheless constitutes psychological injury, requiring processing and recovery. The broader social implications extended beyond individual psychology. Japanese society post-war confronted the reality that government propaganda had systematically lied about numerous aspects of the war. This recognition, combined with defeat's shock and occupation's reality, contributed to fundamental societal transformations in post-war Japan. The occupation of Japan by Allied forces, primarily American, from August 1945 to April 1952, represented the largest-scale test of whether wartime conduct policies would extend to occupation contexts. Approximately 350,000 American military personnel occupied Japan at peak strength, interacting daily with a population of approximately 70 million Japanese civilians. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. General Douglas MacArthur established strict policies regarding troop conduct toward Japanese civilians. Fraternization was initially prohibited, though this policy relaxed over time. Military police enforced conduct standards and courts-martial prosecuted violations. The occupation period saw significant crimes by occupation personnel against Japanese civilians, including assault and murder. However, these occurred as individual violations prosecuted by military justice systems rather than systematic policy. The occupation did not witness the mass violence that characterized some occupations during World War II. Japanese women who had experienced detention on Saipan and returned to Japan now encountered American occupation forces in their homeland. This created complex psychological situations. The same military that had detained them overseas now occupied Japan itself. For some women, previous experiences of proper treatment may have reduced fears about occupation. For others, the presence of foreign military forces in Japan reinforced ongoing trauma. The occupation included significant social transformation. American authorities pushed democratization, women's suffrage, land reform, and educational changes. The Japanese Constitution adopted in 1947 under occupation guidance included Article 9, renouncing war. These changes fundamentally altered Japanese society, though debates continue about the extent to which changes were imposed versus adopted. For civilian women who had been detained on Saipan, the occupation period represented opportunities and challenges. Opportunities included potential contact with American authorities to seek information about missing family members or to address repatriation issues. Challenges included ongoing social suspicions about those who had survived enemy detention and the psychological burden of living under occupation. How Japanese society remembered and narrated World War II experiences has evolved significantly over decades, with implications for how stories like those of Saipan's detained civilians have been understood and shared. Immediately post-war, Japanese society focused on survival and reconstruction. Public discourse emphasized Japanese victimhood, bombing casualties, atomic bombings, hardship, and defeat. This narrative, while reflecting real suffering, initially avoided confronting Japanese military aggression and atrocities in Asia. memories that complicated simple victimhood narratives, including experiences of relatively humane treatment by American forces, did not fit dominant frameworks. Through the 1950s and 1960s, as Japan recovered economically and regained sovereignty, public memory remained contested. Progressive intellectuals emphasized Japanese militarism's responsibility for war and suffering. Conservatives emphasized Japanese suffering and patriotic sacrifice. Neither framework particularly highlighted stories of American forces treating Japanese civilians properly. Progressives had no need for such narratives when critiquing militarism, while conservatives preferred focusing on Japanese suffering. From the 1970s onward, Japan's victim consciousness regarding World War II faced increasing criticism domestically and internationally. Neighboring countries, particularly China and Korea, pressed Japan to acknowledge and apologize for wartime atrocities. This pressure forced more nuanced public memory that acknowledged Japanese aggression alongside Japanese suffering. In this evolving context, stories like those of Saipan's civilian women gained more space. Oral history projects could document experiences that didn't fit simple narratives of victimization or heroism. Women could describe terror caused by Japanese propaganda, proper treatment by American forces, and complex emotions about both. Contemporary Japanese society continues debating wartime memory. Controversies over history textbooks, official apologies, compensation for victims, and commemoration reveal ongoing tensions. Within these debates, individual memories of complex experiences, like relief at proper treatment by enemy forces, contribute nuanced perspectives that resist simplistic interpretation. The experiences of Japanese civilian women on Saipan can be understood more fully through comparison with civilian experiences elsewhere in the Pacific Theater. Different islands, different timing, different military units, and different circumstances produced varied outcomes. On Tinian, captured shortly after Saipan in summer 1944, civilian experiences followed similar patterns. American military government established detention camps, provided food and medical care, and eventually repatriated survivors. Military government reports from Tinian show parallel policies and procedures to those on Saipan. Guam, recaptured by American forces in summer 1944, presented a different situation. Guam had a native Chamorro population that had been under American administration before Japanese occupation in 1941. Liberation of Guam meant restoring American governance rather than establishing occupation over enemy civilians. Chamorro civilians reported brutality by Japanese occupation forces and generally welcomed American liberation. On Okinawa, the last major Pacific Island battle from April to June 1945 produced catastrophic civilian casualties. Approximately 100,000–150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, caught between forces, killed by bombardment, or driven to suicide by Japanese military pressure. Those who survived and came under American control faced similar detention procedures to Saipan, though the scale and intensity of the Okinawa battle created more severe conditions. Philippine civilians experienced different circumstances. The Philippines had been under American administration before Japanese conquest in 1942. American forces liberating the Philippines from 1944–1945 faced complex situations with Filipino civilians who had endured brutal Japanese occupation. Japanese forces in the Philippines committed massacres of Filipino civilians during the liberation fighting, killing tens of thousands. Indigenous populations on various Pacific islands experienced the war as a conflict between foreign powers fought across their homelands. Many suffered casualties, displacement, and destruction of traditional livelihoods. Post-war, most Pacific islands remained under American, British, Australian, or New Zealand administration rather than gaining independence. Korean civilians presented another distinct case. Korea, colonized by Japan since 1910, saw hundreds of thousands of Koreans mobilized for labor throughout Japanese-controlled territories. Koreans in Pacific Islands at war's end faced uncertain status, not Japanese nationals but associated with Japan through colonization. Some Koreans had been detained on Saipan and faced complex repatriation situations. Research on long-term psychological effects of war trauma has documented patterns relevant to understanding the lasting impact on Japanese women detained by American forces during World War II. While these women did not experience the direct violence they anticipated, their experiences nonetheless produced psychological consequences. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, formally recognized in 1980 but observed in war survivors throughout history, can result from anticipated violence even when the violence does not occur. The terror these women experienced while expecting assault, the months of hiding in fear, and the cognitive dissonance of propaganda versus reality all constituted traumatic experiences. Studies of Japanese war survivors, conducted decades after the war's end, found elevated rates of psychological distress compared to general populations. Survivors of bombing, battle exposure, and detention reported ongoing symptoms, including nightmares, anxiety, and depression. The Saipan civilians' specific experiences, anticipatory terror followed by relief, represented a particular trauma pattern less studied than direct violence trauma. Family transmission of trauma has also been documented. Children and grandchildren of war survivors sometimes exhibit psychological effects from parents' experiences, even when parents avoided detailed discussions. The Japanese women's reluctance to discuss detention experiences due to social stigma may have paradoxically increased family impact through silence and mystery. Social support systems significantly affect recovery from trauma. Women who could discuss experiences with family members or community showed better long-term outcomes than those who remained silent. The social pressure to avoid discussing detention complicated recovery for many women who felt unable to acknowledge experiences without facing judgment. Cultural factors also influenced how trauma was processed. Japanese cultural frameworks regarding shame, honor, and proper behavior affected whether women could acknowledge relief at proper treatment without feeling they were betraying expectations of resistance and suffering. These cultural complications added layers to psychological processing. Post-war Japanese society gradually developed more sophisticated understanding of psychological trauma. This evolution allowed later generations to contextualize their mothers' and grandmothers' experiences with greater insight. The preservation of accounts through family histories and oral history projects served therapeutic functions by validating experiences and placing them in historical context. The historical significance of the Saipan civilian detention experience extends beyond individual stories to broader questions about military conduct, propaganda effects, and the possibilities for restraint even in total war contexts. One significance lies in documenting that institutional systems emphasizing proper conduct can function even under extreme combat conditions. The U.S. military's maintenance of conduct standards toward Japanese civilians, enforced through command directives and military justice, demonstrates that systematic policy and enforcement can shape troop behavior. This has implications for contemporary military training and international humanitarian law. The contrast with documented Japanese military conduct towards civilians in occupied territories underscores the importance of institutional culture and accountability. Where Japanese military systems encouraged or required brutality toward conquered populations, American systems prohibited and punished such conduct. These different institutional approaches produced dramatically different civilian experiences. The propaganda's profound impact on civilian expectations illustrates how information warfare affects populations. The Japanese government's systematic lies about American forces put civilians in danger by encouraging suicide rather than surrender. This demonstrates propaganda's deadly potential and the importance of accurate information during conflicts. The psychological impact of cognitive dissonance, when deeply held beliefs confront contradictory reality, offers insights relevant beyond this specific case. Understanding how people process experiences that fundamentally challenge worldviews has applications in psychology, education, and efforts to counter extremist ideologies. For peace education and reconciliation efforts, these accounts provide nuanced material. They demonstrate enemy humanity without romanticizing war, acknowledge suffering without excusing aggression, and show that even amid violence, restraint remains possible. This nuance supports sophisticated rather than simplistic understanding of war. The accounts also contribute to ongoing debates about American conduct during World War II, while properly recognizing the atomic bombing's horror and strategic bombing's massive civilian casualties. These stories document that in some contexts, American forces did maintain conduct standards. This complexity resists both uncritical patriotic narratives and sweeping condemnations. For contemporary military forces, the Saipan experience offers historical examples for training on civilian interaction, detention operations, and occupation conduct. Modern military professional development can examine how World War II forces maintained standards under conditions potentially more challenging than those faced today. Conclusion. The experiences of Japanese civilian women detained by American forces on Saipan in 1945 represent a specific historical case study with broader significance. These women, conditioned by years of propaganda to expect brutality, instead encountered military government administration that provided basic necessities and maintained boundaries. Their shock at this disconnect between expectation and reality, documented through personal accounts preserved over decades, offers insights into propaganda effects, institutional conduct standards, and the psychological impact of war. Understanding these experiences requires acknowledging multiple contexts. The broader Pacific War's massive civilian casualties from all causes, the specific brutality of Japanese military conduct toward civilians in occupied territories, the American strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, and the complex post-war period when survivors processed experiences while Japanese society confronted defeat and transformation. The historical documentation, military government records, oral histories, personal writings, and archival materials provides evidence for conclusions while acknowledging gaps and limitations. Not all voices were recorded. Some experiences remain unknown. Survivors' accounts recorded decades later reflect memory's reconstructive nature. Military records document official policies and procedures, but may not capture all individual actions. What emerges from available documentation is that institutional systems emphasizing proper conduct towards civilians, enforced through military justice and command oversight, can function even in total war conditions. That functioning is neither uniform nor perfect, but represents a significant factor affecting civilian experiences. For the women of Saipan, these systems meant the difference between anticipated horror and survivable detention. Their stories, preserved through family histories and historical research, contribute to understanding World War II's complexity. They remind that even amid massive violence, individual and institutional choices about conduct mattered. They document propaganda's psychological impact and the human capacity to adapt when beliefs confront contradictory reality. They provide historical evidence relevant to contemporary questions about military conduct, civilian protection, and the possibilities for restraint. These women lived the remainder of their lives with memories of those weeks in 1945. Some remained silent, unable to reconcile experience with expectations or fearing social judgment. Others shared stories with family, contributing to historical understanding. All carried forward the shock of mercy when cruelty was anticipated. An experience that complicated simple narratives about enemies, war, and survival. Their voices, preserved in fragments across archives and family collections, ensure that this aspect of Pacific War history remains available for study and reflection.